The auctioneer's gavel was still in midair, frozen over a sea of numbered paddles, when I saw my husband's 1957 Bel Air roll under the sodium lights, its VIN plate practically radiating evidence from the driver's door jamb. I had traced that 17-digit number through 3 state motor vehicle databases, and by the time I walked up to the auction block with a deputy marshal at my elbow, my sister-in-law's forged paperwork was about to land her in federal custody for a list of felonies long enough to wallpaper a courtroom. That was 3 years ago. Now I run Spit Shine and Subpoenas, a mobile detailing outfit where every invoice I hand a customer includes her active warrant number and a 10% discount for law enforcement. Here is exactly how I took back what was mine, one bank statement and one bolt at a time. My name is Elena. I'm 47 years old, and 2 years ago I buried my husband Mark after an 18-month siege of pancreatic cancer that hollowed him out from the inside, like rust through a quarter panel. I was his full-time caregiver, the one who calibrated his feeding pump down to the milliliter, tracked his white blood cell counts on a spreadsheet, and sat up through the night when the pain broke through the morphine. The one thing he never let go of was his 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air convertible, turquoise and cream with a white tarp, a car he'd spent a decade restoring in our 2-car garage. He'd rebuilt the 283 V8 himself, lapped the valves on our kitchen table, and hand-rubbed 12 coats of clear lacquer until the paint looked like wet glass. During the bad days, he'd hold the keys in his palm and run his thumb over the bow tie emblem, and sometimes in the smallest hours, I'd push his wheelchair to the window so he could see the car under the single floodlight I kept burning all night. After the funeral, the Bel Air sat under a breathable cover, appraised at $125,000 by a vintage vehicle specialist. I knew more about that car than I knew about most people because before I married Mark, I had spent 2 years as a title clerk at a Chevy dealership. I learned to spot a faked notary stamp by the ink density, to decode a VIN manually by reading the Fisher body tag, and to smell a title washing scheme the way a bloodhound smells a fugitive. That dusty little fact was about to become the most valuable asset I owned. My sister-in-law Karen, Mark's older sister, had been a ghost during his entire illness. She sent one thumbs-up emoji on Christmas and a group text on his birthday that read, "Thinking of you both, keep fighting." The day after the memorial service, she and her husband Greg materialized on my porch in matching pastel polo shirts, reeking of department store cologne and unsolicited business acumen. Greg sold commercial real estate, or at least he carried business cards that claimed he did, heavy linen stock with a glossy photo of a strip mall he'd never actually closed a deal on. Karen had a marketing degree she never used and a habit of describing herself as a serial brand architect. They sat me at my own kitchen table, poured me a cup of herbal tea I hadn't asked for, and pitched a classic car detailing shop. Our town had a booming vintage car scene, they said, weekend cruise-ins and concurs events, and the Bel Air would be the perfect rolling billboard to attract high-end clients. We'd use the car as collateral for an SBA loan, secure around $70,000 in startup capital, and they'd run operations while I healed. Exhaustion is a kind of anesthetic. I nodded along, my brain wrapped in fog, and by the end of the week I had verbally agreed to form a partnership. 2 days later, a flatbed truck backed into my driveway, and Greg supervised a crew of 3 men who rolled my husband's car into a climate-controlled storage unit he'd rented under the business name Pristine Legends Detailing, LLC. I handed over the keys with a trembling hand. Karen squeezed my shoulder. "You're doing the right thing, honey. Mark would be so proud." The next morning I went into the garage to sort through Mark's old tool chests. I hadn't been in there since the diagnosis, and the air still carried the faint metallic soul of his labor, cutting oil, aged leather, the ghost of carburetor cleaner. That's when I found the lockbox. It was a small olive green ammunition can, dented along one corner, shoved behind a stack of warped oil pans under the workbench. The latch was stiff but not locked. Karen walked in at that exact moment, coffee mug cradled in both hands and her nose crinkled. "Oh, that's just junk, let me toss it for you." She reached for the box, her acrylic nails an inch from the steel, but I closed my hand around the handle and pulled it to my chest. "I'll hang on to it," I said, quieter than I felt. She shrugged and clicked out of the garage, sandals snapping on the concrete. Inside the box were registration slips from 1962, a yellowed owner's manual, a brittle map of Route 66 with a circle around Tucumcari, and a sealed white envelope with my name written in Mark's blocky engineering print. I carried it into the bedroom, locked the door and slit the envelope with a trembling thumb. The note was dated 6 months before he died, and his handwriting was steadier than I expected. Sweetheart, if you're reading this, I didn't make it. I have to tell you something I never wanted to say out loud. Do not trust Karen with the Bel Air. Back in 2014, she tried to get me to sign the title over to her for a business opportunity that turned out to be a title loan scam against a widower in Ohio. When I refused, she stopped speaking to me for 2 years. She only came back around because she thought I'd forgotten. I haven't. If she ever gets near the title, call the bank immediately and check the VIN. I've taken steps to protect you, but you need to be the one to pull the trigger. Protect yourself. I love you. Mark. I read it 3 times, my stomach turning to ice water. He had left a dead man's warning from the grave, and I had just handed his most treasured possession to the person he feared most. I folded the note, slid it into my pocket, and walked back into the living room where Karen was scrolling her phone. She glanced up. You look pale, everything okay? Just tired, I said. She smiled, all lipstick and teeth. Grief is a process, we'll get you through it. Before I continue this story, drop a comment with your city. I'd love to know where you're all tuning in from. And if you believe that when family comes sniffing around an inheritance, it's time to lock every document down tight, hit that like button and subscribe. It really does help this channel grow, and I'll be right back with the rest. I played the part of the foggy, overwhelmed widow so thoroughly that I practically gave myself a concussion from nodding along. When Karen showed up 3 days later with a stack of SBA loan documents, I rubbed my temples with both hands and told her my brain was scrambled eggs. I just can't focus on fine print right now, I said, and I let a genuine-sounding tremor leak into my voice. Can we push this to next week? She pressed her glossy lips together, then her whole face rewrote itself into a mask of syrupy concern. Of course, Elena, I'll hold on to everything until you're ready. I let her believe I was barely functional. I'd fake little memory lapses, ask whether we'd already eaten breakfast, misplace my car keys in the refrigerator. Greg and Karen exchanged those quick sideways glances that say, she's falling apart, this will be easy. What they didn't know was that I was cataloging every piece of mail they left on the counter, every hushed phone call Greg took in the garage. I noticed a brand new $60,000 Sea Ray fishing boat squatting in their driveway the week I moved some clothes into their guest room. It was a 24-footer with a fiberglass hull so glossy, the dealer's temporary tag was still taped to the cleat. Greg spent a whole Sunday afternoon hosing it down while dodging calls from a number his phone labeled Wells Fargo Collections, and I heard him hiss through clenched teeth, I told you we're not late, the liquid funds clear by next Friday. The boat's trailer still had the temporary plate, and I memorized the HIN stamped on the transom, a habit I couldn't unlearn. A week later, while I was perched on their beige guest room bed with a cup of lukewarm tea, they cornered me with a power of attorney form. Just a formality, Karen said, her pen hovering over the signature line like a wasp. So we can manage the business paperwork without bugging you every 5 minutes. I lifted the document and scanned the fine print, letting my eyes drag slowly down the page until I landed on the clause titled, Full Financial Authority including, but not limited to the sale or transfer of titled assets. My blood pressure spiked so hard I felt it in my eardrums. I deployed a classic stall I'd learned at the dealership. I tilted my head, squinted at the page, and said, oh, this looks straightforward. I'll just need the VIN verification waiver to go with it. The DMV requires a separate notarized waiver before any title transfer, and I don't see it attached. I can handle that myself. Let me grab the title from my safe deposit box and I'll walk it through. Total fabrication. I didn't have the title in my box because Karen had already lifted the physical certificate from my file cabinet before I packed my suitcase. I didn't know that yet. What I did know was that I had just bought myself a week of breathing room. The next afternoon, I drove to the storage facility where the Bel Air was supposedly being prepped for the grand opening. The facility manager was a leather-skinned man named Roy who chewed a toothpick and squinted at me from behind a dusty Formica counter. That unit got emptied out last Tuesday, he said. Fella in a polo shirt showed up with a flatbed, said you were selling the car to a collector in Arizona, showed me a notarized bill of sale and a title transfer signed by the owner. My heart hit the concrete floor. Who signed? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Roy flipped through a clipboard and read from a photocopy. Elena DeMarco. Signature matches what I have on file from the rental agreement. Pretty cursive. I leaned on the counter, the edges of my vision going grey. She had forged my name on the title assignment, transferred ownership from Mark's estate to herself, and sold the car out from under me while I was still choosing his urn. I thanked Roy, walked to my car, and sat behind the wheel for 10 minutes just breathing. Then I drove straight to the county tax assessor's office. The clerk pulled the motor vehicle title history for the VIN, and the screen lit up with the digital chain, Mark DeMarco to pristine legends detailing LLC on the 7th, the same day I'd been at the funeral home trying to decide between walnut and mahogany. I printed the page, folded it into my purse, and drove back to Karen's house with a mask of pleasant gratitude plastered across my face. I complimented her meatloaf at dinner and asked for seconds. That night the investigation kicked into overdrive. I waited until 1 a.m, lying fully clothed under the covers, listening to the house settle into its groaning nighttime rhythms. When I was sure they were asleep, I eased out of bed and crept down the hallway to the home office they used as a command center. The door had a cheap privacy knob I could have bypassed with a credit card, but it wasn't even latched. The filing cabinet was a basic 2-drawer Hahn model with a wafer lock, the kind you can buy at any office supply store. My father had been a locksmith for 33 years, and when I was 12 years old he sat me in his shop with a bench vise and a practice lock, timing me with a stopwatch while I learned to pick a wafer core. Wafer locks are simpler than pin tumblers. You insert a tension wrench into the bottom of the keyway, apply gentle rotational torque, and then rake the wafers with a pick until each one clicks into its shear line. The pick is a thin sliver of spring steel with a slight hook at the tip. I had made my own that afternoon from a heavy-duty paperclip, bending it with a pair of needle-nose pliers in the guest bathroom while the vent fan masked the sound. I knelt in the dark, heart slamming against my ribs, and slid the tension wrench into the keyway. I felt the familiar resistance, the faint springiness of the wafers, and I began to rake. 1 pass, 2 passes, a tiny give, and on the 3rd pass the plug rotated with a snick so soft it was almost inaudible. I had it open in 18 seconds. Inside, suspended in a hanging folder labeled Bel Air Transaction, I found the original certificate of title. My signature had been forged on the assignment line in a looping cursive that was close but wrong. The loop on the capital E in Elena sloped the opposite direction from how I actually write it, a telltale detail I'd seen 100 times on fraudulent title applications. Beneath that lay a copy of a cashier's check for $95,000 made out to Pristine Legends Detailing LLC, drawn on a regional bank in Scottsdale, Arizona, and a bill of sale to one Vincent Martelli of Scottsdale. The date on the transfer was the same day I'd been weeping over earn catalogs. I photographed every page with my phone, holding my breath at each shutter sound. Behind that folder was a manila envelope stamped with the Small Business Administration logo. I pulled out an SBA Form 147, a loan authorization and agreement for an express loan of $70,000, guaranteed by the Bel Air as collateral. My name was listed as the primary borrower, my social security number printed clearly on the application. The loan had been funded 6 days earlier, and the repayment schedule called for monthly installments of $1,412 over 7 years, at a variable rate tied to prime plus 2.25%. I had never signed a single page. Inside the same envelope was a promissory note with my forged signature, and a personal financial statement that claimed I had liquid assets of $40,000, which I absolutely did not. That's when the full horror of the scheme crystallized. I wasn't just a victim of theft, I was being set up as the legal scapegoat for her debt. If the loan defaulted, the SBA would come after my assets, my credit, my house. My hands were shaking as I carefully replaced everything exactly as I'd found it, aligning the folder tabs with the same obsessive precision a surgeon uses to close an incision. 2 days later, while Karen was at a heart yoga class and Greg was out supposedly showing an office suite to a non-existent client, I drove to the public library and logged into a terminal. I ran the Bel Air's VIN through the National Motor Vehicle Title Information System, NMVTIS for short. It's a federal database mandated by the Anti-Car Theft Act, and any vehicle that crosses state lines or has a title brand is logged there. I typed the 17-digit number into the search field, paid $8.95 with a prepaid debit card I'd bought at a gas station, and watched the screen populate. The title had originated in my husband's name, then flipped to Karen's LLC on the 7th, then retitled in Arizona under Vincent Martelli. But here is the crucial detail about modern title infrastructure. Any lien holder who has filed a UCC-1 financing statement, that's a uniform commercial code form that records a security interest in personal property, will appear on the NMVTIS report as an active encumbrance. And there it was, buried in the lien holder section, a UCC-1 filing from my husband, Mark DeMarco, dated 2 years prior, listing himself as the secured party. The collateral description read, 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air, VIN ending 4839. The filing was still active, never satisfied or released. That meant Mark had placed a secret lien on his own car, pledging it as collateral for a private loan that never existed, but creating a legal cloud that would survive his death. Any sale without satisfying that lien was fraudulent. The title was dirty and Karen had never checked. I sat at the library terminal, staring at the screen, and for the first time since the funeral I felt the pressure of his hand on my shoulder. He had built the trap long before she ever reached for the keys. I began documenting everything with the discipline of an archivist. I bought a spiral notebook and started a timeline, dates of every suspicious call, amounts of cash withdrawals I spotted on the kitchen counter, the license plate of the boat, the names of banks and loan officers. I overheard Greg cursing under his breath. I made photocopies of every document I had found, sealed the originals in a manila envelope, and stored them in a safe deposit box at a credit union 20 miles away, a credit union Karen didn't know existed. And I continued to observe the cracks spreading across their performance. One afternoon I was in the guest bathroom tightening a loose faucet handle with a basin wrench, an old rigid model with a forged steel head and a telescoping shaft that Mark had given me for my 35th birthday. Karen wandered in, saw me wrestling with the drain pipe and laughed. "Look at you, Miss Fix-It. You know we can hire someone for that, right?" "Old habits," I said, wiping my hands on my jeans. She didn't know I'd spent my 20s sweating in the service bay at a Chevy dealership, that I could disassemble and rebuild a Rochester 4-barrel carburetor in under an hour, and that I could weld a cracked exhaust manifold with a borrowed MIG gun. She also didn't know I'd fixed that same faucet 2 weeks prior and deliberately loosened the packing nut again so I'd have an excuse to be in the hallway when Greg took a call about a lien release that had stalled the Bel Air's sale. I heard the words auction and clean title required, and Martelli is pressuring me before he slammed the phone down. I red-ironed the nut, dried my hands, and filed the information away like a squirrel burying a nut. Over the next week, I catalogued their financial freefall like a meteorologist tracking a hurricane. Greg's phone buzzed non-stop with collection calls, and one morning a repo truck idled at the end of the driveway. I watched Greg sprint out in his bathrobe, waving his arms and shouting about a payment processing error. The C-Ray vanished the next day, sold, I later discovered, for $38,000 to a man who paid in crumpled $20 bills. Karen started selling furniture on Facebook Marketplace, listing their Italian leather sectional and a vintage Wurlitzer jukebox they'd bragged about at dinner parties. Every time I walked into a room, laptops snapped shut and phone calls ended with a hasty, "I'll call you back." I played the part of a woman too submerged in grief to notice anything, but I noticed the half-empty coffee cups on the front porch from early morning meetings with what looked like a bail bondsman, and the stack of overdue utility bills she hid under a pizza box. The tipping point arrived on a Thursday afternoon. I decided to run a test, a final diagnostic to see if there was any residual humanity flickering beneath their borax surfaces. I'd been having mild heart palpitations from stress, nothing serious, but I knew the symptoms well enough from Mark's decline to fake them convincingly. In the middle of their open-concept kitchen, I clutched my chest, gasped, and crumpled sideways onto the terracotta tile. I hit the floor hard, my elbow cracking against the grout, and I lay there moaning with my eyes half open, watching the legs of the kitchen island blur. Greg was on the far side of the counter, sorting a stack of SBA paperwork, and I saw his tasseled loafers pivot. He looked down at me, then at the papers, then back at me. "Karen," he said, his voice flat as a dial tone, "grab the release form. If she's going to die, we need her signature first." Karen stepped over my outstretched legs, her sandal brushing my calf, and snatched the folder from the counter. She didn't kneel. She didn't check my pulse. She just stared down at me with this cold, dissecting expression and said, "If this is one of your drama queen spells, Alina, I swear I'll make sure you never see a cent of that insurance payout." I let out a weak, ragged cough, then recovered 10 minutes later, claiming low blood sugar. They brought me a glass of orange juice and a pen, already positioned over a document that would release the UCC lien, a document she clearly needed signed before the car could sell. I sipped the juice, set the pen aside, and told them I needed to lie down. That night, I wedged a rubber doorstop under my door, a trick I'd learned from a dealership security guard, and understood that any residual family loyalty I'd felt for this woman had been extinguished as thoroughly as a candle in a vacuum chamber. I reached out to the SBA lender that evening, using a prepaid burner phone I'd purchased at a gas station 3 towns over. I asked for the Fraud Investigations Unit, and was eventually transferred to an agent named Melissa Chu. A woman with the patience of a glacier and the voice of someone who's seen every possible variation of small business loan fraud. She listened without interruption as I laid out the forged signature card, the unauthorized title transfer, the UCC-1 lien, and the fraudulent personal financial statement. She confirmed that the Bel Air was the sole collateral for the loan and that the credit union's own security interest was subordinate to Mark's filing. She also confirmed that all $70,000 had been fully disbursed into an account controlled by Pristine Legends Detailing LLC, an account that now held a balance of $912.37. Melissa said, "Mrs. DeMarco, based on what you've described, you are not personally liable for this debt, but we need to build a prosecutable case. Will you help us gather final evidence?" I said yes before she finished the sentence. 2 days later, I met Detective Russ Hargrove in the parking lot of a Cracker Barrel near the interstate. He was a barrel-chested man with a graying push-broom mustache and a badge clip that glinted in the afternoon sun, the lead investigator for the county's multi-jurisdictional vehicle fraud task force. He had been tracking a ring of title washers for months, and Karen's name had surfaced when a mobile notary reported a suspicious signature on a title assignment. He took the photographs from my phone, the NMVTIS printout, and my handwritten timeline, and then he slid a tiny USB device across the table. It looked like an ordinary thumb drive, but it was a hardware keylogger, a data extraction tool that would capture every keystroke, every password, every email drafted on Karen's laptop as soon as I plugged it into her USB port. He showed me how to insert it silently when the machine was sleeping, and how the device would boot in kernel mode and hide itself from the operating system. That afternoon, while Karen was at the grocery store, I slipped into the office, typed in the laptop password I'd watched her enter a dozen times. It was Boat Life 2024, the optimism of which almost broke my heart, plugged the keylogger into the rear USB port and counted to 30. The drive's LED flashed once and then went dark. I pulled it free, slid it into my bra strap, and wiped the desk surface with a tissue to remove fingerprints. My hands were trembling, but it was the steady, controlled tremor of a procedure executed correctly. The keylogger delivered a landfill of evidence. Within 48 hours, Detective Hargrove had transcripts of emails Karen sent to Vincent Martelli, reassuring him that the title cloud would dissolve as soon as the grieving widow signs, and a chat exchange with Greg discussing the best font to mimic my handwriting on a notary stamp. They had registered a fictitious business name and opened a bank account with my social security number listed as the primary account holder, then emptied the loan disbursement into that account. Hargrove obtained a warrant and seized Karen's laptop, her phone, and the filing cabinet, but by then I had already copied everything and moved my own belongings to a storage unit. I stayed in the house only long enough to avoid raising suspicion, telling them I was driving upstate to visit an old friend for the weekend. I spent that weekend in a faded motor inn, reviewing the evidence with Melissa over the phone, while the SBA's legal department placed an administrative freeze on the loan account. A week later, Hargrove called with the location. The Bel Air had been reconsigned to a classic car auction in Reno, Nevada, run by a major auction house that handles six-figure muscle cars. Martelli, the Arizona buyer, had discovered the title defect when his own bank refused to release funds, and he was dumping the car at auction to recoup his $95,000 loss. Karen had been frantically trying to get me to sign a UCC lien release for an entire week, promising me a generous cut of the proceeds, but I had been stalling with vague mentions of dizzy spells and doctor's appointments. Now she was out of time. She and Greg told me we were taking a road trip to Reno to scout a potential second location for the shop, and I agreed with a weary smile. On the drive in their Escalade, I sat in the back seat, watching the sagebrush scroll past the window. Karen turned around in the passenger seat, her face tight with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Elena, there's a tiny paperwork snag. The buyer just needs you to sign a simple release form at the auction office so the title clears. It's nothing, just a technicality. You sign and we walk away with a nice little bonus." She said it like she was offering me a free sample at a grocery store. I nodded, looking out the window. "Okay, Karen, I just want this all to be behind us." We walked into the auction hall the next morning. The air smelled like tire dressing and warm popcorn. Rows of gleaming vintage steel stretched across the concrete floor under towering halogen lights. A 1970 Chevelle SS here. A split-window Corvette there. The auctioneer's cadence cracking through the PA system like a rapid-fire auctioneer's song. Lot 247, my husband's turquoise Bel Air, sat center stage on the preview ramp, its odometer reading 62, 000 original miles, its chrome bumpers polished so brightly you could see your reflection in them. My throat constricted so tightly I could barely swallow. Karen guided me to a small conference room off the main floor where a clean-cut notary in a sport coat waited at a folding table. Greg leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, a sheen of sweat on his forehead. Karen slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a UCC lien release form, already filled out with my name, the vehicle description, and the file number of Mark's secret filing. She had been so frantic to clear the title that she'd actually drafted the very document that would dismantle her entire scheme, not realizing I already knew the lien existed. I picked up the pen, twirled it once between my fingers and set it down carefully on the table. "I'm not signing anything, Karen." Her face bloomed blotchy red. "What do you mean you're not signing?" "Elena, we had an agreement. We had an agreement to open a detailing shop," I said, my voice level, the adrenaline finally crystallizing into cold, clear certainty. "You forged my name on a title transfer, stole a $125,000 car, and sold it out from under me while I was still sorting through my husband's clothes to donate. That's not an agreement. That's 7 felonies, and your active warrant went live in the state database at 9 o'clock this morning." I stood up and walked toward the auction floor, my phone already dialing Hargrove, who was stationed outside with 2 Reno police officers. Karen scrambled after me, her heels skidding on the polished concrete. "You bitter old woman, you'll ruin everything." I stepped up to the auctioneer's podium just as he was about to open bidding on lot 247. I raised my hand, holding a folder with the original UCC1 filing, the forged title and the NM Vetis report, all encased in clear plastic sleeves. "I need to stop this sale. This vehicle is subject to an active UCC lien and a forged title transfer. I am the legal owner, Elena DeMarco." The auctioneer froze, his gavel hand suspended. Security personnel in blazers materialized from the edges of the floor, their earpieces buzzing. Greg bolted for the exit but ran chest first into Detective Hargrove, who was already striding in with his badge displayed. Greg bounced off Hargrove's frame like a basketball off a backboard and was cuffed before he could catch his breath. Karen started screaming about family betrayal and gold-digging sister-in-law, but the deputies were already closing the cuffs around her wrists. I watched her face cycle through denial, rage, and finally a hollowed-out recognition that the house of cards had collapsed. The Bel Air sat silently on the block, its engine cold, its title finally safe, the aftermath unspooled with the satisfying rhythm of a well-tuned engine firing on all 8 cylinders. Karen Delvecchio was charged with 7 felony counts: grand theft auto, forgery, felony identity theft, SBA loan fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, perjury by false notarization, and attempted theft by deception. Greg caught 4 counts: conspiracy, receiving stolen property, bank fraud, and obstruction of justice. They hired a criminal defense attorney who billed $400 an hour, but the evidence was a mountain. The keylogger data showed Karen had impersonated me in emails to the credit union. The forged title underwent forensic document analysis that confirmed my signature was a forgery based on stroke pressure and letter slant, and the notary testified that she had been presented with a counterfeit driver's license bearing my name and Karen's photograph. My staged collapse testimony, backed by Hargrove's recording of their indifference, demolished any defense claiming I had willingly cooperated. Karen eventually accepted a plea deal and was sentenced to 4 years at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla. Greg got 3 years at Wasco State Prison. The SBA loan was discharged as fully fraudulent, and I was never held liable for a single cent. Melissa Chu sent me a thank you letter on SBA letterhead and a ceramic coffee mug that read "Fraud Stops Here," which I still use every morning. I recovered the Bel Air from the auction impound lot, loaded it onto a flatbed, and drove it home under a pale Nevada sky, my hand resting on the passenger seat as though Mark were sitting beside me. Months later, after a complete fluids flush, a carburetor rebuild, and an 18-hour detailing session that left my knuckles raw, I sold the car at a reputable auction to a collector in Oregon for $120,000. With that money, plus a $100,000 theft loss payout from a specialized collector car insurance policy that Mark had quietly taken out years ago, a policy I discovered only when the insurance agent called to express condolences and mentioned a locked addendum with my name as sole beneficiary, I had the capital to start my own business. I named it Spit, Shine and Subpoenas. It is a mobile detailing service, nothing overly fancy, just a box truck with a 200-gallon water tank, a quiet generator, a pressure washer, and a full armamentarium of polishes, clay bars, and microfiber cloths. Every invoice I hand a customer includes a line at the very bottom: Karen Del Vecchio active warrant #WV 2023-04872, 10% discount for active law enforcement. Cops love it. I have detailed cruisers for the highway patrol, a sheriff's department Tahoe, and a detective's personal Mustang GT, and every time I buff a fender or steam clean an interior, I think about my husband and the quiet, meticulous brilliance of a man who filed a single piece of paper that ended up being a cage for his sister's greed. He knew her better than I ever could. He built the trap before she ever reached for the keys, and he trusted me to spring it. I like to think that wherever he is, he's polishing something chrome and looking down with a smile on his face. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? I'd love to hear your story in the comments. And if you are the kind of person who believes in protecting what's yours and standing up to even the most calculating family members, hit like and subscribe. It tells the algorithm that we value justice with a little bit of chrome polish. I'll be back with another story soon. Take care of your ride and your boundaries.